Okay, lesson 8. We're kind of jumping in the middle here. So this is chapter 7. And the background here, set us up real quick. So what we just saw was that the Israelites, even though sometimes they seemed like they were worshiping God, I think they were worshiping God, they also had not really completely put away their idols. And they had idols of Baal in their homes, which Samuel commanded them to get rid of. And they did that. And after they did that, they have another battle with the Philistines. So verse 13, so the Philistines were subdued, and they did not come any more into the territory of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against them, against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. Then the cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron to Gath, and Israel recovered its territory from the hands of the Philistines. Also there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. So this is the result of the Israelites obeying God, putting away their idols, and repenting of having had those idols. And we talked a little bit last time, or maybe more than a little bit, about our own idols in our own lives and how we want to do the same thing. We want to put those away, following their example. So question, what was the result of the Israelites putting away their idols? If you're not sure, we could compare this to the battle. There was two battles. We saw one in chapter 4 and we saw one in chapter 7. Maybe look at the difference between those two battles. So which one? Which battle was won? And you said who won the battle? The Lord. But in chapter 4, they took God with them, right? That was their great plan. They said, we'll take the Ark of the Covenant out of the tabernacle. We'll take it to the battlefield. Since we'll have God with us, we'll win. And yet in chapter 4, they lose. In chapter 7, there's no mention of taking the Ark of the Covenant. And yet they win. And yet you're telling me that it's God who wins the battle in chapter 7 and not in chapter 4. Why is that? Yes, and I think, Nate, I think you made that same comment several lessons ago, was, if you couldn't hear it, the idea is, you know, we want to be on the same side as God, right? But there's a difference between trying to force God to be on our side and us getting on God's side. And back in chapter 4, we don't know it at the time, right? But we know now that they probably had idols of Baal in their possession at that time. Now that, since we had to get rid of them there in chapter 7, we also saw that they had a high priest who seemed like a pretty good high priest in some ways, but he was a bad high priest because he had wicked sons who were also serving as priests, and he was not dealing with that. And so because of that wickedness, trying to force God on their side by carrying the Ark of the Covenant into battle didn't do any good. But in chapter 7, as Kevin just said, now they're getting on God's side. And how did they get on God's side? By being obedient, right? They did what God told them to do. So just carrying the Ark of the Covenant into battle didn't help, but being obedient to God put them on God's side, and as David said, God gave them the victory. So what will be the result of us putting away our idols? Maybe not a concrete answer, but what are your thoughts? What's the benefit? I've been trying to encourage us to figure out what our idols are so we can put them away, but what's the benefit of that? We'll be closer to God. Any thoughts on that? How will we be closer to God if we put our idols away? Yeah, your assumption is you'll be replacing that with God. Now, it seemed that the Israelites kind of try to have both. So what's wrong with that? Why can't we have God and the idols? We still got God, right?
It's about faith.
About faith.
In God.
Faith in God.
Not faith in
Yeah, faith in something else. Yeah. So when you have that backup plan, if God doesn't come through, then maybe this idol of Baal will come through. It shows a lack of faith in God, is what Dan is pointing out. You're not having confidence in God to be enough. You think you need some supplemental insurance to cover you when God's not quite there for you. What else? Why do we need to put away our idols? We don't have a battle with the Philistines, so what is the benefit to us of putting away our idols? Yeah, more time to spend with God. And go ahead. I forgot your name again. Brian. Yeah, go ahead, Brian. Yeah, so these two ideas here, they piggyback on each other very well, right? You'll have more time to focus on God if you put away your idols. And then even worse than that, the passage that was read there, if you couldn't hear, was no one can serve two masters, right? If you try to serve God and Baal, you're going to wind up hating one. right? The Israelites chose to hate Baal. They threw their Baal statues in the trash. If they had not done that, if they didn't come to hate Baal, who would they have come to hate? God, right? Eventually, they're going to serve one or the other. And then just to focus on more time. So I kind of chose the illustration of politics as something which I think, and not just politics, but patriotism, is something which can become an idol to us. There were a lot of other great suggestions mentioned. One of them was technology, and we talked about the things you focus on. And I said I felt judged when someone brought up screen time on the phones, because that's a problem for me. It's a problem for a lot of us to focus on that so much. When you put so much attention on the screen, on the television, on other things, it doesn't leave as much time to focus on God. I made the point, if I spend as much time reading the Bible as I've spent on my phone, I would be one of the great Bible experts in this region. And that's probably true of a lot of us. If we can get our focus off of those distractions, it gives us more time to focus on God. Any other thoughts, comments?
Mike,
Yeah, Nate.
I was trying to remember where the parable is, but Jesus talks about the person who cleaned out the house, but then, got rid of the demon, cleaned out the house, but then when the demon went away, came back, found the house clean, and then invited more demons in.
Yeah.
And so the last state was worse for the person.
Yeah.
So not only in this putting away the idols, we have to make sure that we are using that time to try to get closer.
Yeah, great point. So again, if you couldn't hear me say on the microphone, we've got to, it's not enough to just put the idols away, because if you just put the idols away and try to leave everything empty, something's going to fill that space. The way you keep the idols from coming back and filling that space again later is to fill that space that you've made with God. Excellent point. All right, so I just wanted to follow up briefly on lesson 7. I'm not going to jump in because I've already taken a lot of your time, but maybe we didn't get everything you wanted to talk about done. I know we were kind of rushed at the end of last class. So if there's anything you guys wanted to ask or wanted to say in regards to what we talked about last week, the putting away of idols, or the way that idols kind of creep into our lives, any thoughts or questions before we move on from that? I don't want to move on unless you're ready to move on. Okay, the Amorites, just a real quick slide here. Since the Amorites were mentioned, I just wanted to. The Amorites were descended from Ham's son Canaan in Genesis 10:16. If you missed it, it said at the very end, there was kind of an aside that there was peace with the Amorites. So I just kind of want to briefly say who they were. They were the sons of Ham's son. They were descended from Ham's son Canaan. They had been defeated back in Joshua chapters 10 and 11. The Amorites we mentioned one more time in Samuel. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. The children of Israel had sworn to protect them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. And after this, there's only passing reference to the Amorites in battle. So this seems to have been the point where the Amorites ceased to be a problem for them here after this defeat in chapter 8 or chapter 7. So Samuel judges Israel all his life. So this is verses 15 and 16 from chapter 7. And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went from year to year on a circuit to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and judged Israel in those places. But he always returned to Ramah, for his home was there. There he judged Israel, and there he built an altar to the Lord. However, his sons, I'm going to go ahead and read the first 3 verses of Samuel, and when we get into chapter 8, when we get into chapter 8, we'll pick up with verse 4. But just to look at the very beginning of chapter 8 right here. Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judge over Israel. The names of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. So is Samuel guilty of the same sin Eli was punished for? When I read that all these things his sons did, it reminded me a lot of Eli's sons. Eli was considered so wicked that he was the chief reason that the Israelites lost in battle in chapter 4. Has Samuel done the same thing? We don't get a lot of detail, so we may have to draw some inferences here. That's okay.
I was going to say that we're not told.
Yeah, we're not told. So what could you conclude from us not being told, or from what we know?
That God doesn't want to tell us.
Well, that's true, but did we see God, we saw that God was unhappy with Eli. Did we see God being unhappy with Samuel?
told.
Yeah.
I don't like to jump in
Okay.
and assume something, and if God doesn't say something one way or another,
Yeah.
I don't think
Okay.
we should assume.
Okay, so you think it's possible that this was a great sin in Samuel's life?
It's
Just don't-
possible
but
that God
don't-
just doesn't tell us.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Yes. That's right. So the point was made that back when we saw Eli's sons, they were really stealing from God, right? Because they were taking portions of the sacrifice that they were not entitled to. And here it seems that they're taking bribes, perverting justice. So actually, maybe a lesser sin. In our society, we sometimes don't think about that. I think sometimes we kind of overlook, or maybe non-Christians do, tend to think of sins against God as not being any big deal, right? But really, they're a bigger deal. I agree with what Eddie said, that we don't want to, speak where God has not spoken. I also do think that I don't see Samuel as being held up as, I see the Bible as holding Samuel up as a great prophet and holding Eli up as, as a bad prophet or a bad priest. So I feel like the inference I tend to draw from that is that maybe Samuel is less responsible for his sons. What was it that seemed to make Eli responsible for his son's guilt? Was it just the fact that they're related and the son bears the guilt for the father, or the father bears the guilt for the son? Was that the reasoning?
I think one of the things that Eli is, he somehow received some of the gain, I think it was exactly from what they were doing.
Yeah, I think it was suggested that Eli was gaining from that as well. But really, it seemed that Eli made no effort to do anything about it. As we talked about, as a parent, we don't want to make the mistake that Eli made and just let our children sin without rebuking them. But at the same time, they're responsible for their actions. Maybe Samuel tried. Eli never really seemed to try to do much. When God told him what he was going to do, Eli was pious in the sense that he said, hey, I'll accept whatever God wants. But at no point did he ever said, hey, I'm going to change. That was not really on his radar. So maybe we can't say for certain, but I feel like maybe the difference here is that maybe Samuel did not ignore, just you can't always fix the people you want to fix, unfortunately. Yes?
I mean, you look at both Eli and Samuel, they were priests, they were trying to serve God, and yet their children ended up not.
Right.
I think that, especially as a young Christian parent, no, you've got to do more than just have your example. There's got to be some teaching or something. Somehow, there's a disconnect between them and their children.
Amen.
Parent, you've got to figure it out.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's a tough thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. So this is why I love you guys to make the comments, because you come up with good points that would be lost otherwise. So the point, if you couldn't hear what Kevin is making, is, sometimes it's not enough as a parent to just teach by example. Eli, and Samuel especially, Samuel's living it right. He's doing everything he's supposed to do. His children grow up seeing that, and yet they're still wicked. Sometimes as a parent, we have to do more than just lead by example. Sometimes you kind of have to stop and say, wait a minute, right? You have to try something else. Maybe it's rebuke, maybe it's something else. And the other reason I put this in here was, when I draw a point, was, back before, I wanted to illustrate the fact that as parents, or really, as people who have loved ones that we want to see do right, we do have a responsibility. Eli had a responsibility to try to train his children correctly. And I think one of the lessons from Eli's example is, we don't want to be like Eli. We want to train our children up in the Lord. But I think the lesson of Samuel here is that it still might not work. We can't feel guilty if we try to raise our children right and it doesn't work, because sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's going to be our responsibility, absolutely. But sometimes it isn't. You can't always tell from the outcomes whether you did enough or not. All right, we're going to jump into the meat of the first half of Samuel 8. I'll read verses 4 through 10. Here we're going to see the Israelites ask for a king. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now, therefore, heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. Okay. Questions? What reason do the people give here for wanting a king? They want to be like other nations. It's part of it. Anything else? They want new judges, right? They don't like, they mention what bad judges Samuel's sons are, so that seems to play into it as well. But so we've got Samuel's sons not being good judges. They also want to be like other nations. Why do you want to be like other nations? Yeah, the grass always seems greener, right? This is one of those places where I feel like we should understand, right? Sometimes the Bible has to spell things out. Some things we should just understand because it's so typical, right? Are we like this? Do you see what your neighbors have and think, gee, I wish I had one of those? Anybody ever done that? Eddie, go ahead.
There's also a big change here from what we saw in the book of Judges to now. Before, God had always appointed a judge when there was a need.
Yeah.
Now the people are thinking there is a succession plan. Samuel's growing old, so we've got to get a replacement for him. This is the first time we see that.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And I noted this a little bit later, but we can talk about it now because I didn't really have a lot to say about it other than to point it out. But Eddie mentioned that in the Judges, God raises up a judge as a need. But now we're kind of thinking it's a succession plan. And the people seem to have that in mind. They want a hereditary kingship. But it seems like it kind of starts before they get this idea, right? Because when I read Samuel's sons became judges, I was like, wait a minute. Why are Samuel's sons? That's not the way it was in Judges, right? You were a judge, and then when you died, God would pick another one. You didn't just say, well, hey, boys, you be the judges now.
The leadership up to this time had always been the elders of the tribes.
Yeah.
And now the people seem to want to organize it more than God had
Yeah,
organized.
yeah. And I think the reason that they want to organize more than God is because that's what everybody else is doing, right? I mean, so there's this influence of, hey, look at what everybody else is doing. And not even stopping to ask themselves, is what everyone else doing better? But just this desire to be like everyone else, which is a common desire. Go ahead, Eddie.
And it makes me think that that's something that we see historically in churches after the end of Inspiration, where churches had their local organization that God designed, and then people said, let's organize more. Let's get churches together, let's get those leaders together, and ultimately end up with a pope.
Yeah, and we don't know specifically, but that was it is kind of unique, I think, among religions to have this local leadership, to not really have centralized leadership. So it was kind of ingrained in the way people apparently thought, people who became Christian, that you ought to just have kind of like someone at the top of the pyramid. And I think you see that in other religions. And maybe it was looking around saying, hey, this is just the way you're supposed to do it. The Israelites are looking around saying, hey, everybody's got a king. I guess that's the way you're supposed to do it. Can we be guilty of that? Right. I know Eddie's already brought up one example of the church itself, right? Churches sometimes look around and say, I've seen this used as an example of why something should be done in the church, rather than going to the Bible, saying, well, other churches do this. Have you ever heard anybody appeal to works of other churches? I sometimes heard it kind of sneak in, like sometimes it's like we won't be able to bring people into the church if we don't do this, right? If we don't have instrumental music, no one's going to come visit us because everybody expects instrumental music in church. We don't have it, so we're not going to get any visitors. I've heard that appeal to being like everybody else, to kind of fit in, and there's always some pragmatic reason for it. But is that what we're supposed to do? No. And that's not what they were supposed to do. So let's see. Samuel's sons didn't walk in his ways. We mentioned that. They were not happy with the leadership they had. Other nations had kings. We mentioned that. And in verse 10, it mentions they want someone to fight their battles. So they may have been thinking that, hey, local leadership may not seem like the best. We see this in the United States, right? The War Powers Act, right? What's the reason why the president has the authority to go in and wage war without an act of Congress? We haven't had a war declared since World War II. We fought a lot of wars. And the rationale is you need a strong leader to be able to act decisively and quickly, right? You can't let the committee, discuss what you're going to do to fight your battles. So there may have been some thinking along those lines there. If we're led, as Eddie pointed out, that we're led at this time by a bunch of individual leaders of each tribe, we will not be able to react quickly, right, in times of war. We need a king to lead us in battle. Okay. Why did the request for a king upset Samuel? Yeah, it's different. It's not what they're supposed to do. You know, Samuel is a God-fearing man. It's not from God. Anything else? It's a reflection on him. I think that's part of it too. Because it's God who points out they're rejecting me. Right? Samuel apparently was not thinking, hey, you're rejecting God. Because God he doesn't realize that, I don't think, until God told him. I think that's why God told him. Samuel initially sees it as a rejection of Samuel. It was a rejection of God's rule, as Eddie pointed out. It was also a rejection of Samuel. I put a question mark. But I see that. I see when God says, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me, kind of comforting Samuel a little bit. It was because Samuel saw this as a rejection of himself. Okay, so those were the two things I thought of. Anything else? Any other thoughts on why Samuel is upset that they're asking for a king? Okay. All right, let's look at the next few verses here in Samuel and see what happens. Because when we left off, God had told Samuel to let the people know what the results of their request was actually going to be. Picking up, I'll read verse 10 again, and then read the rest of the chapter. Or not the rest, I want to stop at 19. Okay, so Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s, will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers, and will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. And when he takes all your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work, he will take a tenth of your sheep, and you will be his servants, and you will cry out in that day because of your king, who you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but we will have a king over us. Okay. Doesn't sound so good. What's the difference between a judge and a king? Yeah, a judge judges, a king rules over them. And the reason I want to ask this is because they already had leadership, right? So I want to make it clear what's the difference. So a judge judges, a king rules over. How does that look different practically, though? What are some of the practical differences? Go ahead, Eddie.
Well, we talk about a kingdom. And a kingdom, the dove is domain.
Right.
But it's the idea that the life of the nation is tied up in the king himself.
Yeah.
And that's really the key here, is the fact that they rejected God as their king. God is no longer their life. Now it's this appointed man who becomes their life.
Yeah, and that point that the two are tied together, we'll get to a little bit later, but when this is finally said and done, Samuel's going to write a book, right, that lists the responsibilities of the king and the rights of the king. So that's something you don't see with the judges. I actually didn't put it in the list here, but I think about it now when you talk about how they're bound up together. There's a much tighter relationship between a king. There's a kingdom, there's a domain, as Eddie said, that belongs to the king. And you didn't have to have this long list of rules for who did what, because you didn't have the judge was not sort of head of state the way the king was. Other thoughts on differences? We mentioned one earlier, for the most part, the judge, I've got to get a list here. God tells them all these things the king is going to do, and they're things that judges haven't done, right? He says in verse 11, a king will take the people's sons and appoint them for his own chariots to be his horsemen. A king will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make weapons of war and for equipment of his chariots. A king will take a tenth of the people's grain and their vintage. A king will take their male servants, female servants, finest young men, and donkeys, and put them to his work. A king will take a tenth of the people's sheep. The people will be his servants, will be the king's servants. And the judges judge Israel as needed. Eddie brought this up earlier. A kingship is a permanent institution that exists perpetually and drains the resources of the people, whether or not the king is doing anything of value for the people or not. So once the king defeats the Philistines, he's not going to go away. That was kind of the beauty of the judges, right? Once God lifted a judge up, they defeated the Philistines, And then the judge didn't have to be a burden on the people. The king is going to continue to do all this stuff even when there's peace. He's still going to take their stuff and make it his own. Judges were usually chosen directly by God. God chose some of Israel's kings, but most simply became king because they were the sons of the former king, whether they were men of God or not. I put the footnote there as we discussed. Samuel's sons do not seem to be chosen directly by God. They just, this idea of inheritance seemed to be creeping in already. And I noticed, there's not a biblical list of good, bad kings. If you go to the children's classes, sometimes you'll see the timeline, right? You notice that in the children's classes, the art for the king's faces, if they're a good king, they smile. You know what I'm talking about? I've seen a couple of nods. If they're a bad king, they frown. And if they're kind of in the middle, they're kind of, the face is kind of in the middle. And so I found a list in an ESV Bible that tried to calculate the number of kings. It says Israel had 18 bad kings and one that was so-so. And Judah had 12 bad, if you count Queen Athaliah, 4 mixed and 4 good. Again, these aren't carved in stone numbers from God, but ballpark figure, you can kind of see that bad kings greatly outnumbered good kings. This is what Israel is signing up for when they get a hereditary kingship rather than letting God just pick his judges as they're needed. Thoughts or comments? David?
Yeah, one thing that just makes it so interesting is even back in Deuteronomy 17, God told them, okay,
I think we're coming to that, yeah. Yeah, hold that thought. I want to get that just was it 17 or 14 or, well, yeah, are you talking about where God talks about a king? We're going to look at that in a second. That's confusing to me. Okay, but I have questions. Okay. And Samuel heard all the words of the people and repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. Did God need Samuel to tell him what the people had said? Eddie shaking his head, no. I don't think so. I just thought that was odd. I always find passages like this interesting where someone tells Samuel something and Samuel turns around and goes and tells God like God doesn't know. Go ahead.
I would think this shows Samuel's subjection to God.
Yeah.
He goes back to God, I think, God.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's waiting for God.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think it shows he knows God. It's got to be kind of rude to go to God and say, hey, God, you know I'm here. Tell me the answer. He goes ahead and he tells these things to God. But we recognize, I think, that God already knows. Okay, Genesis 17:6. I will make you exceedingly fruitful and will make nations of you. This is God talking to Abraham. And kings shall come from you. And then in chapter 35, verse 11, and God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. Do the prophecies that Abraham will be the father of kings only apply to his children of Ishmael and his sons by Keturah? Shaking your head no. So you think this applies to the children of Israel as well? So God has prophesied this is going to happen. Okay, Deuteronomy 17. Is that where you wanted to go? Okay. When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you and possess it and dwell it and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren, you shall set it as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. So here's my question. If God prophesied that Israel would have a king, really all the way back in Genesis, and then in Deuteronomy he prophesies more specifically that the people would ask for one, why is it a rejection of God for them to ask for the king like God had said they were going to do? Seems to me like they're just following Deuteronomy. Go ahead.
Trying to intervene for God.
They're trying to intervene for God?
Just like Abraham did when he took Hagar for his wife. He tried to intervene for God rather than waiting for God to fulfill it.
Okay.
They're trying to intervene for God to get their purpose rather than wait on God.
Okay. And David, do you have a comment as well? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's prophesied that Christ is going to be crucified, and yet we don't look at Judas and say, good job, Judas, just fulfilling the word of God. And your point was, you made a parallel with Abraham, right? Abraham had promised a son, but he was still wrong to take Hagar as his wife to try to fulfill the prophecy, because that wasn't the way God meant for it to happen, even though God had prophesied he was going to have a son. Go ahead, Eddie.
It also is such a great testimony of the power of God to anticipate, plan for, and design his response when people sin against him. absolutely, when they're demanding a king, they're sinning against God. God had already anticipated that before he created the nation. He already had a plan in place, and he's implementing his plan.
So you're kind of what David said. You're seeing it in very similar terms, whereas God is not the will of God that Judah should portray Jesus, but he foresees it and works it into his plan. Other thoughts, other comments, other questions? All right, good. I just kind of wanted to acknowledge this because even though it's very clear in Samuel that this was not the will of God and that God sees it as a rejection, later if you stumble across Deuteronomy 17, you may kind of scratch your head a little bit. It doesn't sound like this doesn't sound like this is a bad thing. It sounds like it's something God wanted. Another thing I would point out is the reasons, and this kind of comes back to what you were saying about Hagar. At least in Abraham's case, he was trying to do the will of God. I don't see that here. I don't see anywhere it says, hey guys, remember God said that this was going to happen? Let's go ahead and do that now. Their motivation seems to be that they were not happy with the leadership God was providing and they wanted earthly leadership. So even if the ultimate outcome of having a king is God's will, right, and this seems to be part of God's plan, because this is the beginning, not with Saul, but after Saul with David, this is the beginning of the Messianic line, which is going to lead to Christ. So this is all part of God's plan, but that doesn't seem to be why they wanted a king. They seem to want it for other reasons that involved rejection of God. And I'll get Kevin to get you just a second.
I think that's the point there. They had personal reasons, personal things they wanted.
Yeah.
They were not trying to follow God's plan.
Right. It's sometimes our own selfish things that we do might coincidentally or incidentally run parallel to God's plans for a little while, but if we're motivated by selfish reasons, our path is going to diverge from God's at some point. Did you have a comment, question? Oh, sorry. If we were in an auction, you would have bought it. Mike.
I mean, I think it's my understanding that, in the beginning, before the beginning of God's plan of salvation, we don't look at Adam and Eve and think, well, they just kickstarted.
Yeah.
Probably that same logic.
Yeah, exactly. Even like when you look at something like in Genesis all the way back with Satan is going to, bruise his heel, but he's going to bruise his head. That God already had this plan in motion. So when we go back to Genesis, what was it, chapters 17 and 35, and see that God already had this idea that kings are going to come from Abraham, that doesn't mean that what the people here did in Samuel was correct. But it's all still part of God's plan. Yeah.
And I think this is all tied up in the concept of the king anyway. He is a monarch, that he is going to lead in the way he wants to go. And when God sent Jesus, of course, he's a monarch,
Yeah.
and he leads in God's
Yeah.
way. They were trying to go in their direction.
Yeah. Again, emphasize that point. They're not trying to follow God's plan so much as they're trying to do what they want, which seems to be based in large part on simply wanting to be like all the godless people around them. Okay, good thoughts. All right, so let's look at Saul. Saul's going to be introduced here. Look at... let me finish up. I didn't read the last 3 verses there of Samuel. I'm not sure why I left them out. I think maybe at one point I had a slide with them, but let's just read those real quick. So finishing up chapter 8, that we may also be like all the nations, and the kings may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the will of the people and repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. So the Lord said to Samuel, heed their voices and make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, every man go to his city. So even after hearing, once again, that this is not what God wants for them, at least not at this time, and all the bad things that are going to happen because they have a king, things that are bad for them personally, things that they're not going to enjoy being under the rule of a king, they still want one. And that brings us to chapter 9. Read the first 14 verses.
Mike, there is one point to make there.
Sure.
In verse 20, they wanted the king to fight their battles for them.
Yeah.
It doesn't say lead us into battle. It says he will fight the battle
Yeah.
for us. And that's a big shift to
Yeah.
change because it had always been the responsibility of every man over the age of 20 to go into the army and fight the battle. They don't want to do that anymore.
That's interesting. I have not caught that because if you go back and look at some of the things that he said he was going to do, he will take some of the sons, he will take of the people's sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen. Some are going to play, some will make his weapons of war and his equipment for his chariots. The king will take a tenth of the people's grains. So some of this deals with having an army, right? Having chariots. It seems like, I've not caught that, but it does seem like this is the beginning of a standing army. Whereas, rather than saying when there's an attack, all the able-bodied men will come together and we'll all fight this battle together, this is a shift towards having a standing army that can fight the battles. And if you're not in the standing army, we have that in this country, right? I'm not in the army, so I don't have to worry about it.
I think this is, again, as Dan's point, it's very selfish. We don't want to fight these battles anymore. The king will do it.
The king and his army. The king will have his own army, they'll fight the battles, and we won't be bothered by it. It will create a big disconnect. Yeah, I think that's interesting. And if you see that, if you go back and look at the history of the anti-war movement in the United States in the 1960s, what generation was it that was the most likely to be opposed to the war? It was the generation that had to fight it. The generation that didn't have to fight it, maybe they fought World War II, so I'm not saying that none of them were ever soldiers, but they weren't going to have to fight it anymore. War becomes a lot more real if it's something you've got to take responsibility in. And so by having a king, there may be this element of, well, he'll have an army, he'll fight the battles, we will not be affected by war anymore. It will no longer be our responsibility. Yeah, good, very good point. Anything else? Okay. Don't have a whole lot of time. I'm going to go ahead and read this, and because I'll read it this time, we will not read it next time. We'll just pick up with the questions. But 1 Samuel chapter 9, first 14 verses. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Becherath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel, for his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost, and Kish said to his son Saul, "Please take one of the servants with you and arise and go and look for the donkeys." So he passed through the mountains of Ephraim and through the land of Shalishah, but they did not find them. Then they passed through the land of Shalem, and they were not there. Then they passed through the land of the Benjamites, but they did not find them. When they had come to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, "Come, let us return, lest my father cease caring about the donkeys and become worried about us." And he said to them, "Look now, there is in this city a man of God, and he is an honorable man. All that he says surely comes to pass. So let us go there. Perhaps he can show us the way we should go." Then Saul said to his servant, "But look, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread of our vessels is all gone, and there is no present to bring the man of God. What do we have?" And the servant answered Saul again and said, "Look, I have here at one hand 1/4 of a shekel of silver. I will give that to the man of God to tell us our way. Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he spoke thus, 'Come, let us go to the seer,' for he was now called a prophet, was formerly called a seer." Then Saul said to this servant, "Well said, come, let us go." So they went to the city where the man of God was. As they went up the hill to the city, they met some young women going out to draw water, and said to them, "Is the seer here?" And they answered them and said, "Yes, there he is, just ahead of you. Hurry now, for today he came to this city, because there is a sacrifice of the people today on the high place. As soon as you come to the city, you will surely find him before he goes up to the high place to eat, for the people will not eat until he comes, because he must bless the sacrifice. Afterwards, those who are invited will eat. Now therefore go up, for about this time you will find him." So they went up to the city. As they were coming into the city, there was Samuel coming out towards them on his way up to the high place. Okay, so this is our first introduction to Saul. Let's kind of recap some of the things we learned about him here. He was a Benjamite. His name means ask for. His father was named Kish. Kish was a man of wealth. Saul was handsome, apparently extremely handsome. Makes him sound like the most handsome man in Israel. Saul was a head taller than most men. While searching for his father's lost donkeys, he learns from his servant that they are near the home of a prophet, Samuel, so they go to see him. He says his family, the Matrites, are the least of all the families in the smallest tribe. We didn't read that verse yet. It's down in verse 21. But so he claims to be from the smallest family of the smallest tribe. But his father was a man of wealth. So within that tribe, his family is well-to-do. Okay. So, any thoughts? This is really just an introduction to Saul here. I don't want to do a real long reading to finish us up. I think to get in the meat of the chapter, we'll have to look at the second half, and I will save that reading for next time, so we kind of start fresh on it. But any other thoughts or comments, or I'll let us go a couple of yeah, James, go ahead. Uh-huh. What's that? Yeah, he does seem like a good candidate. In a lot of ways, what makes him a good candidate for king at this point? Yeah, he's tall, he looks good, yeah. He seems like a pretty decent fella. You know, when we see the way he acts, he seems humble. He seems respectful of the prophet. Go ahead, Nate.
On that particular note, he seems to be somewhat thoughtful.
Yeah.
Which we see
Yeah.
later on,
Yeah.
because he says, well, we're going to go to him, we have to bring him.
Yeah. And even he starts with his father, right? We've been gone a long time. My father's going to stop worrying about the donkeys and start worrying about me, right? So he's respectful to his father. He's respectful to the prophet. Do we see anything that might make him not ideal at this point? Go ahead.
He seems to have the appearance of being tall and handsome.
Yeah.
He seems to be ill-prepared for the task.
He may be ill-prepared. That's kind of what, and we'll see something that hints at that a little bit later. And I think, it's the smallest family from the smallest tribe. He probably doesn't have a lot of experience with the day-to-day runnings of a kingdom. So he may be inexperienced, but he does. That doesn't, David's the shepherd boy, so God can fix that. In terms of personality, he does seem like a good candidate. Is he a good candidate?
But there's a difference of color.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
We see a foreshadowing here, because the woman told Saul, you need to go into the city, because the seer has come here, we're going to be offering a sacrifice, but nobody will do anything until he arrives to bless the sacrifice. That's foreshadowing a very important event in the life of Saul as king, when he does not wait for Saul to bless the sacrifice.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had not picked up on that, so yeah. Okay. Yeah. We're kind of jumping ahead, but yeah, at this point, we do want to emphasize this point, because we know the end of the story, it's kind of easy to look at Saul as like, oh, he's a horrible, but at the beginning, he seems like a really good choice. He's going to become a bad choice, but he seems like a good choice really at the beginning. And I would go so far as to say, not only does he seem like a good choice, he is a good choice, because who chooses him? God, right? So God sees fit to choose Saul. So when we see good things about Saul, it's not a misconception. Saul is going to start out as the right man for the job. We probably know enough about the story to know he's going to wind up not being the right man for the job. But he's going to start out as the right man to be king of Israel. Other thoughts or comments before we wrap up? Okay, so we'll look at the rest of Samuel next time and see how this appointing of Saul happens in a week. Thank you all.